Good afternoon, and welcome to Entry Point, where we take a deep dive into the latest entries from Encyclopedia Virginia with the contributors who wrote them. I'm Patti Miller, the managing editor of Encyclopedia Virginia, and I'm really pleased to be hosting today's program about Virginia women during the American Revolution. For those of you who aren't familiar with EV, we're a free, reliable multimedia resource that tells the inclusive story of Virginia for anyone seeking to understand how the past informs the present and the future. You can access all the entries we'll be discussing today and all our entries at encyclopediavirginia.org. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started today. We will have time at the end of this event for questions, so please leave any questions you have in the Q&A panel, in the Q&A feature on your Zoom panel, and we will get to those when we have time to do that. The event also has closed captioning, so please hold on one second. Let me just okay. Great. The event also has closed captioning, so you can turn on and customize that closed caption tab at the bottom of your window. Now, I'm super pleased to introduce today's panelists. Rebecca Rose is the author of our new entry on Women of the Army, sometimes better known as Camp Followers. Rebecca is a graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University, where she received her master's degree in history. I'm going to put a link to the entries we'll be discussing today in the chat, so you can read these in full when you have some more time. So that is Rebecca's entry. Also joining us today straight from class, very much appreciate that, is Cassandra Good, who is the author of our new entry on women and political participation in revolutionary Virginia. She is an associate professor of history at Marymount University and the author of Founding Friendships, Friendships Between Men and Women in the Early American Republic, and The First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. She is also the author of the Audible Great Courses class on America's Founding Woman, and I'm putting Cassie's entry on political participation by Virginia women into the chat as well. Before we get started today, I just want to say that we do have a great overview entry available on Encyclopedia Virginia about American women during the American Revolution that takes a broader look at women during the American Revolution. Let me see if we can make that do a little slideshow. Where are we? And what's important to realize about American women during the Revolution, which was from elite women who often participated at the highest levels of political discourse, which we'll talk about today, to more average women, the loyalist shopkeepers, indigenous women who were forced from their land by the Revolution, and enslaved women like the women who fled to Lord Dunmore, and some of them eventually found freedom in Nova Scotia. The experiences of women were really diverse during the American Revolution, and we want to recognize that we're really only talking about two specific aspects of American women during the Revolution. So I urge you to check out our overview entry about American women during the American Revolution, which, like all of our kind of larger scale entries, pulls together a lot of different aspects of our of the experience, and then we can dive into some of the more specific aspects. So we're going to do that now with Rebecca. Rebecca is going to talk to us about what are popularly known as camp followers, but what George Washington gave the honorific the woman of the army, because they became so important to the army during the Revolution. So Rebecca, tell us about the women of the army.
Absolutely. So, can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. So bear with me for the most nerve-wracking part of this. I'm going to share my screen. I have some images, and I have to make sure that I do this properly. So I will pull up some nice images for you all. So my entry is on Virginia Women of the Army in the American Revolution. And the fun part, of course, of any Encyclopedia Virginia entry is, of course, figuring out the unique Virginia angle on the topic. So Women of the Army in the American Revolution is a huge, broad topic. And the fun part was really drilling down to figure out what, if any, unique contributions did Virginia women make to the Continental Army during the American Revolution? And what was the experience of women attached to the Army in Virginia? So women who weren't necessarily from Virginia, but of course, with their whatever role they were attached to the Army in Virginia. So our first image is a detail. This is one of only 2 images, surviving contemporary images of women of the Army from the American Revolution. And so we have some women visible here doing things like maybe laundry, caring for children, and cooking. So keeping those questions in mind about what specific contributions Virginia women made. I'm going to alternate between the broader context of women of the Army and zooming back in to discuss Virginia-specific people and events where I can. So overall numbers of female camp followers can be hard to ascertain from the surviving Continental Army returns, but likely hundreds of Virginia women followed the Army during the American Revolution, most often as wives of soldiers. Many soldiers did not have the means to support their families, meaning that their wives had no choice but to join them on campaign to receive rations for themselves and their children. Thinking about Virginia specifically, frontier violence in the West or British raids in the East may have led some Virginia soldiers' wives to become camp followers because they no longer had resources or homes. Other female attendants on soldiers in the Continental Army were paid servants in the households of officers. And of course, enslaved Virginia women had no choice whether or not to become camp followers. We also have evidence from newspaper ads, runaway ads, that indentured servants and enslaved women became camp followers voluntarily, whether out of a pre-existing relationship with a soldier or to pursue whatever economic opportunities were available to women in Continental Army encampments, such as cooks or laundresses. So that's most female camp followers. They were, as the vestrymen of Williamsburg's Bruton Parish Church put it in 1777, they were, quote, necessary attendants on the camp, performing essential labor for their husbands or employers. But also, to return to that quote from the vestrymen of Bruton Parish Church, those would be colonial society's muckety mucks. They were concerned that their parish would have to provide alms for these women when they were in town following the army. And, quote, most were the poorest sort of our people. So again, most of these women are following the army out of economic necessity because they are they require the rations that the Continental Army provides. General Washington considered women to be a, quote, clog on the efficiency of the army, especially when they rode on baggage wagons, as pictured here. This is one of the other 2 surviving images of female camp followers from the American Revolution. This was uncovered very recently, and it's very exciting to have it in the entry. You see these women riding on a baggage wagon. And Washington issued, I think, 25 orders concerning women of the army during the Revolution. And I forget what percentage had to do with, please stop riding on the baggage wagons, you're going to exhaust the horses and encumber the supply chain. But of course, you know, these women are marching oftentimes with children. Of tension as the Continental Army is on the move. So Washington, he has this complicated relationship with women of the army, where on the one hand, they are an encumbrance and a clog, but he also recognized that the presence of wives and other women was necessary for morale, not only because of the comfort and the care they provided, but also because a man who knew that his family couldn't put bread on the table at home was unlikely to stay with the army and serve. But that brings us to discussing a very different category of female camp follower, officers' wives. So these are women who are not joining their husbands out of economic necessity, but to provide moral support. In fact, the absolute top most famous female camp follower in the American Revolution, in my opinion, is, I'll give you a hint, she's a Virginian, none other than Martha Washington. Martha Washington began traveling from the Washington's family estate at Mount Vernon to be with General Washington at his winter headquarters, starting in the first winter of the war, 1775 to 1776. So she travels up to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and once with her husband at his headquarters, she hosts social events, she receives visitors, and provides moral support to the man who she calls, quote, her poor general. Washington found his wife's presence so essential that he asked her to join him at, oops, and I want to show you a picture of Martha Washington. So there she is. And that's a 1772 portrait, so it's pretty contemporaneous with the Revolution and the time that she's visiting her husband. And so she's hosting social events, receiving visitors, and he finds this so essential and also her emotional support that he asked her to join him at winter headquarters for the next 6 years. He also asked the Continental Congress to reimburse her travel expenses because the journey from Mount Vernon to wherever he was headquartered was often difficult and expensive. As she made her way north, Martha Washington was often greeted by public ceremonies, escorts, and celebrations because she was the symbol of the Revolutionary War effort. So very much unlike the average female camp follower who is a necessary part of the army, but is also not well off. As we saw with the vestrymen in Williamsburg, local communities are concerned, just like they're concerned when soldiers come through, that their local resources are going to be eaten up by these people. Martha Washington, with her whole retinue, when she goes up to visit George Washington, she is kind of the most famous and most elegant camp follower and a morale booster, really, for everyone when she comes into camp. So officers' wives, unlike ordinary women, tended to make seasonal visits to their husbands. So they're not year-round following to support their husbands and get rations. So only when their husbands are not on active campaign are they showing up to the encampment, and they usually live in more comfortable lodging outside of the main encampment. They don't typically wash, cook, or nurse wounded soldiers. Instead, they attempt to boost the Army's morale by hosting social events such as balls and dinners. And this allowed their husbands more time to focus on military planning and administration rather than social obligations. So less gritty, of course, than the work that the majority of the Army did. The majority of women of the Army did to keep the Army running, but still necessary labor because they are freeing up their husbands to do more of the military logistics and strategy when they take on the social obligations and some of those sort of morale boosting events. For most women, however, as I mentioned, camp life was much less glamorous. We're not talking balls, we're not talking fancy dinners, we're not talking about sleeping in whatever mansion was locally available that could be commandeered for officers and their wives. Camp life was difficult and dirty. Encampments often had separate tents or huts for women, but sometimes women slept in the same tents with their husbands and their messmates. Despite the circumstances, however, women attempted to recreate some semblance of family life, and children were born and raised in encampments. The Continental Army habitually faced hygiene problems. One of the ways that women could be punished and even banished from camp was failing to relieve themselves in a properly designated location, which kind of gives you an idea of the hygiene level of these encampments. And women of the Army could find themselves in trouble in a number of other ways as well. At the extreme, some sought to take advantage of the opportunity to make money through illicit trade or even theft. And it's also worth discussing that although the term camp follower may have connotations of prostitution, most prostitutes who catered to soldiers actually did so in cities where their clientele would visit them from camp. Women in camp were frequently scrutinized by officers to determine their legitimate connection to soldiers and their eligibility for rations, because again, these women are receiving provisions and resources from the Army. Soldiers and unmarried female camp followers were also regularly checked by Army surgeons for venereal disease. For the most part, because of their important work cleaning the clothes of the Continental Army, women were most likely to run into trouble with Army authorities over their laundering practices. This is, again, along with riding on the baggage wagons, laundry is a real point of contention between women of the Army and Army authorities. Laundresses charging high prices from cash-strapped soldiers was a consistent matter of contention, and sometimes commanders actually set laundry prices to prevent overcharging. Women were also frequently punished for washing laundry in unsanitary water or contaminating drinking water sources by washing laundry in the drinking water. And for the record, dependent women typically received one ration a day from the Army, but unless they were specifically employed as laundresses, nurses, or cooks by the Army, women camp followers did not earn money for the labor that they performed for their families. So the majority of nursing, cooking, and washing was uncompensated because these were just women taking care of their family members. So uncompensated except for bed and board provided by the Army. Okay. So we've broadly covered camp life for women of the Army. And let's take a moment to talk about these women's experience of combat, since what is the Army there to do? Fight. And these women are there to support their fighting men. So Continental commanders wanted to keep women far away from combat, but they were not always successful in doing so. Despite constant orders to stay with the baggage train, but not on the wagons themselves, if you remember, so that they would not encumber the Army on active campaign, instances of women cooking for soldiers on the battlefield, bringing soldiers water during battle, and on very rare occasions, serving in combat themselves occur throughout the war. Two women camp followers in particular, both originally from northern states, have interesting Virginia connections and stories of experiencing combat that we have because after their husbands had died, they applied for government pensions, either from the state government or from the national government, for their service during the Revolution. So I'm going to share those two stories briefly. First, we'll discuss New Yorker Sarah Osborne, who you see here on the left, at the age of 109, apparently. This is from 1854, an illustration of her. She marched with her husband's company from Philadelphia to Virginia during the Yorktown campaign at the end of the war. Sometimes on foot, and sometimes allowed the privilege of traveling by horse or wagon, she baked bread and washed clothing for her husband during the campaign. Once at Yorktown, she and the three other women attached to her husband's company, and she remembered to the end of her life, these other women and their roles. They stayed just behind the American tents, and they brought food to soldiers in the redoubts. On one such occasion, Osborne actually recalled meeting General Washington, although who knows, her memory may have been somewhat embellished by the time she was applying for her pension, but she recalled meeting General Washington, who asked her whether she was afraid of cannon shot from the British. And she replied that she was not. She joked that British bullets would not cheat the gallows, that the enemy would prepare for unsuccessful revolutionaries. She added that it would not do for the men to fight and starve too. Osborne cooked for soldiers on the day of British General Charles Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown and became an eyewitness to the event. The next woman with a Virginia connection that we'll talk about is Anna Maria Lane, who was the wife of a Connecticut soldier. She actually disguised herself as a man and served alongside her husband in the Battle of Germantown on the Philadelphia campaign in 1777. And on the right here, up top, that is an 1878 painting of the Battle of Germantown. Lane stayed by her husband's side when he re-enlisted in the Virginia Light Dragoons a few years later, and the Lanes went on to spend the rest of their lives in Virginia. In 1808, Anna Maria Lane actually applied for and received a pension from the Virginia Assembly for her service, quote, in the garb and with the courage of a soldier, end quote. Most women's experience of combat, however, were much less direct and dramatic, but I wanted to highlight these two women's experiences, especially because they have those Virginia connections. Anna Maria Lane lived out her life in Virginia, received a pension from the Virginia Assembly recognizing her service, and Sarah Osborne had this very dramatic experience at Yorktown, a dramatic journey down to Yorktown and then culminating in witnessing the surrender. So to sum up, women helped keep the Continental Army running through their physical labor and their emotional support. George Washington himself explained in 1783 that when faced with the hungry families of soldiers whose homes had been destroyed by the British, he was obliged to give provisions to the extra women or lose by desertion some of the oldest and best soldiers in the service. Virginia's camp followers played a crucial role supporting the Continental Army during the American Revolution. They washed clothes, nursed the sick and wounded, provided essential sustenance by cooking for soldiers, even under fire, like Sarah Osborne, and organized other forms of entertainment and support for soldiers according to their resources, like Martha Washington. Most importantly, their presence helped ensure that the men they followed, from officers down to your average soldier, stayed with the army and helped the American Revolution succeed.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm so glad we were able to do this entry and kind of bring back all these important contributions these women made and dispel some of the myths about people thought about camp followers being prostitutes or hangers-on who didn't do any important work. So thank you so much for that really comprehensive overview of the importance of camp followers. And now we're going to turn it over to Cassie, who's going to tell us about women's political participation during the Revolution.
All right, can you see my screen? Okay, great. So I want to give you a sort of an overview of the entry and maybe dive in a little bit deeper than I do in the entry on a few places, talk about some of the images. So just to start us off, the entry sort of starts before the revolution with the imperial crisis, which women were really a big part of. Part of that was through newspapers. So you see an image of the Virginia Gazette, and you can see, if you really squint in the top left under that double line, Mrs. Rind. This was published and edited by Clementina Rind. Her husband had been publishing the paper, and she took it over after his death. And she ran stories on protests against various policies from England, and usually those were with a patriotic slant. She also wrote articles urging women to participate and urging people, but women in particular, to protest British policies through boycotts. And boycotts were a really important way for women to participate in politics because they already had the purchasing power. And so they could refrain from purchasing, especially things like tea or clothing. And at this point, there's not a great deal of industry in the colonies itself, particularly somewhere like Virginia. And so if you want to have cloth that is not imported, you are going to have to make it at home. And so that's where we get women's participation in something called homespun. And what they're doing is they're making their own cloth and then wearing clothes made of that to broadcast their political views, literally with their visual presence with their bodies. And I love the portrait included at the beginning of the entry, which I'm guessing, I saw Catherine Garrett is here, and I know she does a lot of the images. So I'm guessing that she is the one who dug into this. And I had actually not seen this portrait before or knew about it. And just looking at it, you wouldn't know that there's a political message here. But in fact, as Katie dug up, that blue knot represents Sons of Liberty. So she's supporting the Sons of Liberty. And then she has a book that is open to page 92, which apparently refers to 92 delegates in the Massachusetts House who voted to protest the Stamp Act, the glorious 92. So even though she is definitely not wearing homespun, this is clearly imported silk. She is showcasing her patriot views through what she is wearing. I'll just touch briefly on women at war since Rebecca gave us such a great overview of that. Part of what's happening, though, with women sort of not at the war, but during the war, is that they are going to have to control their own households when their husbands are gone. And so women are taking up new financial responsibilities and new powers. Abigail Adams, much farther north, is a great example of this, but this is happening across the country. And as Rebecca shared, we had women like Martha Washington accompanying their husbands in not always very comfortable situations. Here is a pincushion from Mount Vernon that Martha is believed to have embroidered while she was at Valley Forge. There's also women serving as nurses, and we tend to think of nursing as a female-oriented profession, but that was not the case then. And female nurses were paid much less than male nurses at this time, and that's still going to be the case even when you get to the Civil War. Another way that women could be involved in the war effort, once that war has started, was with fundraising. And there was a massive fundraising campaign by women that was started by Elizabeth de Barrett Reed in Philadelphia. And she wrote to women in different states, and she worked with Martha Washington and Martha Jefferson in Virginia. And what you're seeing here is the only surviving letter by Martha Jefferson. The rest of her correspondence was burned. And it is about this fundraising effort. So you can see it's from August 1781. And she is noting, I undertake with cheerfulness the duty of furnishing to my countrywomen an opportunity of proving that they also participate of those virtuous feelings which gave birth to it. And these women raise a good deal of money. The statistics on that are actually in the broader entry that Patti shared with us, but they raise a lot of money in Virginia. Interestingly, when Reed writes to George Washington and says, okay, we want to donate this money to the soldiers who really are not getting paid. And I mean, things are bad enough with the soldiers that there's stories of being able to trace where they've been by the blood from their feet because they don't have shoes. But Washington's response to this is, well, that's great, but I think they're just going to spend the money on alcohol. So why don't you use the money to get linen instead for clothes? So ultimately, they did that, and in fact, also made shirts from that linen. And a lot of the women participating in that also put their names in those shirts so the soldiers would know who it was from. We also have women that did not wholeheartedly or at all support the war effort. So, of course, we have people that are loyalists. We know that a good chunk of people in the colonies were still loyal to the British. It was generally assumed that if a man was a loyalist, that the wife was as well. That was not always the case, though. So here we have Mary Willing Byrd, whose husband was a suspected loyalist, and he died by suicide, and then she was charged with supporting the enemy at a certain point. And she writes to the governor of Virginia to defend herself. And she says, you may rely on my veracity when I assure you that no action of my life has been inconsistent with the character of a virtuous American. I cannot express violent, enthusiastic opinions and wish curses and destruction on the meanest individual on earth. It is against my religion. I wish well to all mankind, to America in particular. What am I but an American? All my friends and connections are in America. My whole property is here. Could I wish ill to everything I have an interest in? So she is able to sort of differentiate herself in this letter from loyalists. And we will also see her come up again because she was certainly an opinionated woman who was also quite wealthy and owned a lot of property. Now, some of the property ownership at this point, of course, was in enslaved women. And there were women who in Virginia escaped to British lines because the Virginia governor, Lord Dunmore, had issued a proclamation in 1775 offering freedom to enslaved people who came to British lines. And what we have here is a document by Lund Washington, who was keeping up Mount Vernon in George Washington's absence. And this is a list of the 17 people who fled from Mount Vernon to the British. And you can see that there were 3 women, Lucy, Esther, and Deborah. And these are all fairly young women, too. We know that Lucy and Esther were ultimately recaptured at Yorktown and sent back to Mount Vernon in 1781. Deborah, though, is able to make it to Nova Scotia, and she shows up on lists, and there's an image in the entry of one of the lists from Nova Scotia that includes Deborah with the last name Squash. All of these people had last names at the time. They just usually were not recorded in these records. And so this didn't necessarily mean that these women supported the British cause, but it becomes an opportunity for freedom. And certainly they are hearing the rhetoric of freedom and liberty, and this is an opportunity for them to claim that. I want to talk a little bit about political ideology during this period and women's political claims in this period of equality and liberty. And we tend to think first of Abigail Adams' famous quote, "Remember the ladies." And that is often interpreted as shorthand for give women a role in government, women should have a right to vote. But it's something much narrower than that. What Abigail Adams is actually talking about is that women need to be protected from abusive husbands and that they need more rights within marriage. And so that's a much narrower ask. There are not women explicitly asking for the vote at this stage. There is a woman in Virginia named Lucy Ludwell Paradise who makes a very similar request to Thomas Jefferson, asking for a law to protect women's finances from their husband's exploitation. And then we also have women who are widows who own property in their own right and recognize that they are basically being taxed without representation, which is what the revolution is supposed to be all about. And one of them, Hannah Lee Corbin, we don't have the letter she wrote, but we have her brother's response, Richard Henry Lee, who writes back, "You complain that widows are not represented and that being temporary possessors of their estates ought not to be liable to the tax. The doctrine of representation is a large subject, and it is certain that it ought to be extended as far as wisdom and policy can allow. Nor do I see that either of these forbid widows having property from voting. Notwithstanding, it has never been the practice here or in England," which is actually not 100% true. "Perhaps 'twas thought rather out of character for women to press into those tumultuous assemblies of men where the business of choosing representatives is conducted." And I will say that this is very much the argument used when the suffrage movement starts in the mid-19th century about why women shouldn't be able to vote, is that polling places were too raucous and it wasn't safe for women to be there. So this is, a response we're going to see a lot more of later. And then I have a snip from a letter from Mary Willing Bird, who we heard about before, who is saying, "I have sent my soldier who has lost his life in the service of my country. I have paid my taxes and have not been personally or virtually represented. My property is taken from me and I have no redress." So she's referencing the fact that part of the colonist claims against Britain were about, we are being taxed without representation, and the British can tell us we have virtual representation. We're not really happy with that. But she's saying, I don't even have that. So she's not explicitly asking for a vote, but she's sort of hinting that if she's paying taxes, she should have a say in this. Now, the role that women ultimately get in this period right after the revolution is generally called the Republican wife or Republican mother, and that's small r Republican. It's not related to the Republican political party. And I just wanted to give you examples of two Virginia women, Eleanor Parke Custis Lewis, Martha Washington's granddaughter, and Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe, James Monroe's wife. Nellie said at one point, "I am becoming an outrageous politician." And she was very partisan. She was definitely high Federalist. She called supporters of the French Revolution barbarous democratic murderers. And she later referred to Jefferson and his party as those animals. I guess among those animals would be the Monroes. And Elizabeth Monroe here actually took political action while she was in France when James Monroe was ambassador there during the French Revolution. And she actually was able to help get Lafayette's wife out of prison during the Revolution. So we can see women that are finding their political voice after the Revolution, even though they do not gain anything near the vote or even really better property rights. So I want to close by just suggesting that we tend to picture this founding era and the revolution as an all-male affair. And even when we look at images, the women are there. So you can see in this painting, there's women down on the floor. This is Washington resigning his commission. And then you can also see up in the balcony is Martha Washington with her granddaughters. But this also raises a note of caution about sources from this period. And if you saw, this painting was done in the 1820s, so it's 50 years after the event. Martha Washington was not at this event, and her granddaughters were toddlers or young children at this time. They were not the young women depicted here, besides the fact that the artist of this Trumbull was friends with the Custis granddaughters and would have known that they weren't there and that they were too young to have been there. So he's clearly imagining this. And this is part of the fact that when we get narratives and images of the revolution 50 years later, we're often getting a mediated story that, Rebecca hinted at this with the Sarah Osborne pension. Those pensions are from the 1830s. This is a lot later. It is hard for us to know, did she really meet George Washington, or does she think it's going to help her get the pension by saying she did? And I would say to anybody who is a student or who supervises students, these pension records are so rich and need so much more analysis. There's really, I think, especially rhetorical analysis, looking at these as a genre and the ways they conform to certain standards and may embellish. I don't think people are knowingly, blatantly lying, but they are trying to shape a story that will get them a pension. And we know that sometimes those stories are not factually accurate. We get a lot of stories about women spies and other heroines from the Revolution that just have no basis in any facts we can find. So I would just say to use caution when you're reading about women in the Revolution, to look at what is the primary source, when was it written, do we know if we can actually verify this, and let's try and make sure that as we're rescuing women and bringing them back into the story, that we have the best evidence we can. So I'll just close just sharing my email address. If anybody wants to be in touch, I'm happy to answer emails. And I think I will stop the share there.
Thank you so much, Cassie. That was fascinating. And that is a great caution. I will say we spend a lot of time in EV with both visual images that Katie Garrett pulls for us and with our transcriptions of primary documents that our assistant editor Julia Chafers does for us, trying to figure out what's real and what's not real and what we can use. But I will say, we have transcribed quite a few of those pension records when they attach to an entry or portions of those pension records, and they are a really rich source for exploration, even with their flaws and understanding they were written a long time after and people really want the pension. But they are still really the few firsthand accounts we certainly have by average soldiers of that. Tell me, Cassie, so for you, when you teach, what do you think is your students' biggest misconception about women during the Revolution?
I mean, I would say just this is the first semester I've gotten to teach women's history, and that has been a lot of fun. And just every day, it feels like the students' minds are blown, whatever I tell them that women were doing, because they're just like, we have never learned any of this. And so I think that, the misconception is basically that women aren't there and women are not present in these big events. And, if you look at some textbooks, there's been a lot of surveys done of curriculum and textbooks, and I think it's getting better. But I think there's still, if you look at the bestsellers on the Revolution, it is mostly focused on men. So I'm not surprised that my students would be surprised.
And I think my experience mirrors that. I consider myself to have a good education in history in school, and yet none of this information, I did not receive any of it in school. And then there's almost the opposite of that. Rebecca, maybe you can talk to this a little bit. Do you have a thought why the persistent myth that camp followers were prostitutes? I guess we could trace probably popular literature and popular prints from the era, but that is the most persistent myth about camp followers. Do you have any thoughts about why that becomes really the image of camp followers that we're really just chipping away at now?
That's a really interesting question. I wonder if some of it comes from later wars where that term camp followers comes to be applied to a certain kind of woman who is seen as a hanger on and trying to make money in whatever way she can off of the army. Um, so I think that might be part of it, especially as now, I have to double check myself, but I'm pretty sure during the Civil War in America, it is not nearly as common for women to go on campaign with their husbands. And so I think the connotation of a woman then being attached to the army, if she's not a nurse and employed, which is also something that changes very much between the American Revolution and the Civil War, and during the Civil War, in fact, then that woman is not following her husband. She is unattached, and there's this kind of stigma around that. So I think some of it is just what happens later and how armies change as time goes on, and it just becomes much less common for and uh, expected for some women to follow their husbands.
It is hard for us to imagine, the army, of course, during the revolution has just been created. It's just been put together. Washington is having a hard time even keeping the soldiers together in many cases. To understand that there was no formal, I think there was a quartermaster, but in terms of supplying the army and in terms of doing laundry and things like that, there was no formal structure in existence at that time. So women were really pulled in. One of the things you highlight in the entry, which we didn't really talk about, um, as in most wars, it was disease who got more soldiers, that got more soldiers in the revolution than actually fighting. And it's lice that transmit typhus, and that was a killer disease in the revolution. So the fact that they were keeping the laundry clean, that's why Washington quickly came to realize, oh, this is very important to the well-being of my military. We can't just discount. It's not like that having clean shirt was a nice luxury. It was keeping people alive. They also had very few supplies, as we mentioned, the women's campaign. Really, Washington says, don't give them money; they'll drink it. Give them clean shirts. That's what they really needed. There's accounts at Valley Forge of men not having shoes at Valley Forge. So it was keeping those few supplies that they did have functioning was a big part of what these women were doing. So this was not a luxury, as you point out. This was a very fundamental to the how the actual military was running during the wars. We do have a few questions from some folks who joined us, so we can dive into those a little bit. One is a question from one of our other contributors who wrote about the Bill of Rights for us and is writing about the Constitution, Linda Monk. She has a question about whether Martha Jefferson's letter was sent to James Madison's mother, that was to a Mrs. Madison. But having just attended a talk on that, I can say no, the Mrs. Madison that she was writing to was a friend of hers in Williamsburg, who she was writing to. So that was not to James Madison's mother, although she did very much in that campaign tap into her networks to ask for money for that fundraising effort, which again, I think to Cassie's point, shows another way that women were active behind the scenes in a way that was difficult to see, but is not visible if you really take the time to drill down into it. She received the request to join in this fundraising campaign, Martha Jefferson. She wrote to her friends. They raised a great deal of money. Some of her friends gave jewelry, they gave gold, whatever they had. I forget the actual amount of money the Virginia woman raised, but it was quite a significant amount of money. But then later on, it becomes, oh, well, Martha Jefferson kind of wrote a letter to some friends, and it wasn't a big deal. So you do see this somewhat persistent telling of the story of women in the revolution, that they weren't participating, but of course they were participating in the ways that they were allowed to by their roles in society at the time. Someone else was wondering about the text of the Women of the North Carolina Brigade. Can you read that, Rebecca? Can you see what that text says underneath that? And I will say, while Rebecca looks for that, I believe that was found very recently, that image of the North Carolina Brigade sketch has been given to us with permission by the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, which is one of our partners in working on our section on the American Revolution in Virginia. And I believe it was found in a desk drawer in New Jersey, if I'm correct. Somebody was pulling out a desk drawer in New Jersey and was like, what's this? And it was a contemporaneous sketch of a North Carolina brigade going through Philadelphia that somebody made. Can you see that text on there, Rebecca?
Yes, and I will also put a link to the image entry on Encyclopedia Virginia in the chat. What I'm seeing is it says, some of it's a little faded, an exact representation of a wagon belonging to the North Carolina Brigade of Continental troops, which passed here, Philadelphia, August. I can't read the date. And I will just go ahead and put that. You can make it quite large on the website, so I'll put that link in the chat for everyone.
And we have been able to verify that there was a brigade, moving through Philadelphia at the time. So we do know that was the circumstances under which that image was taken. It is interesting that there is so little documentation of women at this time, and this important role they played. Obviously, that's another reason I think it's so hard to see women in the revolution is because you think of the Ken Burns Civil War documentary where you have, men writing home to women and women writing back, and at least you have this sense of the voices of women. During the Revolution, there was no mail service. People didn't write back and forth from home, so you don't really have a good sense of what these women were doing. That's why the pension records become a very important artifact, and very few real sketches, even of kind of men contemporaneously working in the field. So the other question I have for you all is, when you were working on these entries that you were so great to contribute to us, for you, even as historians, for Rebecca, what was the biggest surprise for you in working on these stories?
So I'll come back briefly to the question that you asked me about the misconception that women were all camp followers, were prostitutes. Um, and I think that was something, just that term, I had that association with it. And I think the biggest surprise for me, or just something that I'd never thought about, was just how differently the Continental Army worked from what we certainly the modern army, but even a little later, because as you just mentioned, the uh, supply chain, the office of the quartermaster, that all worked very, very differently. And a lot of the functions that we now consider to be army departments, or that even came to be considered part of the army by the Civil War, were not at all under the control really of the army during that period. So it was, women were basically trying to continue. Those who had to follow their husbands out of economic necessity were trying to continue doing things like cooking and washing and nursing, as they would have their husbands at home, because there was not really any kind of official military way of doing that. So that was just fascinating to learn about, or kind of dive deeper into, because it's just wasn't something that I thought deeply about before. And the other thing was sort of considering Martha Washington as a camp follower, and thinking about the class differences between women who have these very different experiences. Because I think in popular imagination, when we think about women in the American Revolution, the thought of Martha Washington at Valley Forge, working on that pincushion, maybe, I think that is something that a lot of people with just any kind of knowledge of the American Revolution, if they think about Martha Washington, might remember. So it was interesting to kind of consider her as part of that category of women of the army as well.
And it is interesting to think about her doing that, because although she did, she traveled probably by a nice coach, and she stayed in probably a private home near Mount Vernon, near Valley Forge, it was not without dangers. I mean, traveling at wartime, it was just not without danger. I mean, she took some risks, and she did it repeatedly. I mean, she traveled almost every winter after that to join Washington. And just as he saw the having the wives along kept the morale up of the enlisted men, it certainly kept the morale of the officers up too, to have the balls and things that made them feel like they were kind of part of the civilized world, I guess. The other thing that's worth mentioning, which you mentioned, is a number of these women were pregnant or traveling with small children, which is really mind-boggling when you think about them walking. There's it's not from Virginia, I don't think. There's a description of some camp followers coming through a town somewhere, and the women have their goods slung over their backs in a pack, and they're carrying babies in their arms, and they're dragging a toddler along on the side. I mean, to imagine doing that for a serious amount of time with young children is it's kind of mind-boggling that the perseverance that it took to do that really puts those women up on the same level as the soldiers who had to persevere through these terrible winters, and these, certainly they weren't in battle for the most part, but they faced real hardships in doing this. Cassie, for you, what's the most surprising thing do you think about women in the American Revolution?
Well, I just want to sort of piggyback on that comment about Martha Washington and the fact that this is not without risk. I skipped over in the talk for time purposes, but there's a quote from Martha when she first joins George Washington at war at Cambridge in 1775. She writes a letter saying, "Some days we have a number of cannon and shells from Boston and Bunker Hill, but it does not seem to surprise anyone but me. I confess I shudder every time I hear the sound of a gun." And then she says, they're pulling up the wharfs for firewood. To me, that never see anything of war, the preparations are very terrible indeed, but I endeavor to keep my fears to myself as well as I can. And I think about the sort of emotional labor that she has to do there. And I knew more about Martha, but I'd say that the thing that surprised me was the fact that the closest we get to any women really asking for the vote in the revolution is two women from Virginia, not Abigail Adams. And, I knew about the Hannah Lee Corbin letter vaguely. I didn't know about the Mary Willing Bird letter before. And it just hadn't occurred to me, usually, especially when we get to women's rights activism 70 years later, it's in the North. It's not really happening in the South. Um, and so it's interesting that it would be two Virginia women.
And two Virginia widows who own significant property and
Yeah,
were disturbed by the fact that they were paying taxes and yet had none. Now, of course, New Jersey would allow women to vote for a period after the Revolution
right.
before rescinding that. So it wasn't a far-fetched idea that women who were not married, of course, would be allowed to vote because once women were married, they were considered covered by their husband's votes. So they no longer had
Right.
a separate civic persona. But the idea that unmarried women who had inherited property or widows who were in charge of property could be allowed to vote, as Hannah Lee Corbin's brother says, just kind of out of basic fairness because they're paying their taxes, was obviously not a crazy idea to a lot of people.
Well, and I noted he says, oh, that doesn't happen anywhere. Actually, in England, women who owned property and were not married could vote in some municipal elections in the 18th century and then definitely in the 19th. And so there is a sort of precedent here, and I have not figured out yet how many American women knew this, but it was even if a woman was a property owner, she gets married, her vote goes to the husband. If they then get divorced and he doesn't own property in his own right, he loses his right to vote. So like it is, and in New Jersey, a friend of mine found this incredible newspaper story about a woman who waits to get married so that she can vote. Because once she gets married, she's not going to be able to vote.
But that is interesting because it suggests in that the first case you just talked about, the vote was tied to the property in some ways, not to the.
Right.
So, but logically, because women did inherit, especially if they had no brothers, sometimes they did inherit large estates. So that logically should have entitled them to vote under kind of the absolute rules. But obviously, that
Yeah.
did not happen. And speaking of the Army, and Rebecca was talking about women in the Army, one of our viewers notes there's a new exhibit at the National Army Museum at Fort Belvoir, which is up Northern Virginia near Mason Neck, titled The American Soldier in the Revolutionary War. And it has a 3D image of Anna Marie Lane. So that's really interesting that it's closed right now, unfortunately, because of the furlough. But when the museum opens up, they say it's worth a trip to see it. So that's great that the Army is recognizing this woman as part of it would be really great if they had a camp follower image to really round things out. I'm sure people who supply the modern Army would be a little horrified at the catch as catch can way that war was run. But it is, again, another, to wrap it up, a larger reflection on the American Revolution about how people kind of came together to make this war happen. Even if it was, as a lot of these women, it was out of necessity. They had to follow their husbands because they had no way to make a living. Some of these, especially as the war went on and Washington is really pushing for greater compensation for the soldiers, a lot of these soldiers weren't property owners. You think of the woman left at home to run the farm, which was certainly true and which was also its own kind of hardship, especially if British soldiers were coming through or there was fighting nearby. But a lot of the men who fought eventually did not own property and were fighting because there was a wage attached to fighting. And you see Washington trying to keep upping the bonuses, the signing bonuses, as it gets harder and harder to attract people. So it's just interesting to think about. This is a joint effort between men and women and not just something that men did on their own. So I think we'll leave it there. Do Cassie or
Well, I
Rebecca?
do see there's one hand in the audience, so just wanted to give that person a chance.
Thank you. What do we have here? Oh, am I getting that? Sorry. If you do have a question, can you drop it into the chat? Because I'm not seeing it
You can
otherwise.
see on my participants thing, it shows Peter Headland has a hand raised.
Oh, okay, Peter, what you wanted to send me a question? And there it is.
Oh, and chat is, yeah, you can put it in the
Oh,
Q&A.
oh, sorry, that's why it's disabled. I'm so sorry. But it should go in the Q&A.
And I'll also put in the chat, I had just seen a posting yesterday about an America 250 Revolution book group, and all of the titles were about men. There was not one that included something on women. And I was like, you know what? I want to just post a reading list on my personal blog of reliable books on women during the American Revolution.
Oh, awesome.
So this is, I just did this last night. If people are looking for other books to read, where, you know, historians have been more careful with their sourcing, because yes, as you said, you know, you try and track down some of the sourcing on some of the stories about women, and it's like, where's this coming from?
Where's that
But
coming from? Well, of course, and of course, I'm from New Jersey originally, so of course we have the famous Molly Pitcher rest stop
right.
in New Jersey, which Molly Pitcher apparently was not a real person. And
Yeah.
when I was growing up, I was always like, "Oh, Molly Pitcher, that's so great!" And I was a little heartbroken to find out that there was no Molly Pitcher, though she is supposedly a amalgamation of several different women who did participate in the revolution in New Jersey. Anyway, it's time for us to wrap things up. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Cassie, for joining us today, and everyone who tuned in today. If you found today's event valuable, please consider becoming a supporter of Encyclopedia Virginia. I will drop a link in the chat. Your donations make it possible to keep EV online at a time of decreased federal funding for the humanities, and we really just appreciate the support. I will also drop a link to our newsletter in the chat, and you can sign up for our newsletter. You can find out when we're posting new entries about the revolution. You can find out about new events for our entry point series. And on that note, I will say our next entry point series will be on November 5th. And that is going to be on slavery at the Chiswell lead mines in Virginia, which is a really fascinating story, both about how most of the Patriot ammunition was produced, but also the fact that it was produced largely by enslaved people who did, under Dunmore's proclamation, try to run to the Loyalists and were captured and were sent to work to hard labor at the lead mines as a punishment and a warning to other enslaved people to not try to escape. So that wraps things up today. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you so much, Cassie and Rebecca, for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.